I'm very pleased to be with you tonight and to be able to talk about my favorite author, J.R.R. Tolkien, and about the function of fantasy, as we have in my title. Now, fantasy is an extremely popular genre today. In any bookstore, you go to the bookstore and you can find a substantial section for fantasy and science fiction authors. Authors like C.S. Lewis with his Chronicles of Narnia, or J.K. Rowling with Harry Potter, or Madeline L'Engle with A Wrinkle in Time, or George R.R. Martin with Game of Thrones. All of these very popular, and of course J.R.R. Tolkien himself and his works continue to have enthusiastic readers. And the popularity of this genre extends from the printed page to the screen, both the big screen and the small. All of the titles that I've mentioned have been adapted for film and television, with big budgets, all of these, and with lots of audience interest. Now, in my view, some of these efforts have resulted in genuine artistic success, and others, in my view, not so much. And here we might briefly quote from The Hobbit, suggesting that Tolkien himself was prescient as a film critic. Now, that's to say nothing of countless other fantasy films, television series, and video games, both those that are obviously fantasy and those that are sort of fantasy-ish, like Doctor Who or Buffy the Vampire Slayer. And now there's something deeply appealing about fantasy as a genre. Not only do we see it in popular offerings like these, but we see that it is far from being a passing fad. From the ancient Babylonian epic of Gilgamesh, to the Old English Beowulf, to Shakespeare's A Midsummer Night's Dream, fantasy has been taken up by countless storytellers over thousands of years for one basic reason: audiences like it. But why? What's so special about fantasy? How does it work? And that's the question that we're going to consider tonight, and our guide and teacher will be none other than J.R.R. Tolkien, the author of the most important work of fantasy of the 20th century. Now today, in the 21st century, fantasy brings to mind most readily things like elves and dwarves, kings and warriors, medieval-esque worlds imagined in great detail, magical items, strange prophecies, quests, epic battles, and so on. In fact, it's extremely difficult today to imagine a fantasy world or story that's not affected by or imitative of Tolkien, especially if you look at the broadest popular level. Not just books and films, but video games, role-playing games, and even children's toys reflect the Tolkienian influence. For the Victorians, elf suggested a diminutive flower fairy. For us, it suggests a warrior of a proud, wise race that's older than humans. It's a big difference, and the difference is Tolkien's. Even the tendency to publish fantasy in trilogies, or trilogies of trilogies, stems from the production of The Lord of the Rings in 3 volumes. The Lord of the Rings is one book. It's not a trilogy. It just happened to be printed in 3 volumes because of publication reasons. But that accident of publication has itself shaped the genre, making trilogies the way to go. So we can see that The Lord of the Rings shaped not just the literature that came after it, but even readers' expectations of what fantasy should look like. And ironically, the effect of Tolkien's work on the genre has so influenced and even distorted later readers' responses that it affects their responses even to The Lord of the Rings itself. So at this point, it can be well nigh impossible to imagine the fantasy genre without imposing on it ideas that are taken from the Lord of the Rings or that are taken from reactions against the Lord of the Rings. But if we are to understand the value and the potential of fantasy as a genre, we need to be able to think clearly about it, about what it is and how it works. C.S. Lewis, in his book A Preface to Paradise Lost, gives us some wise advice. He says the first qualification for judging any piece of workmanship, from a corkscrew to a cathedral, is to know what it is, what it was intended to do, and how it is meant to be used. After that has been discovered, the temperance reformer may decide that the corkscrew was made for a bad purpose, and the communist may think the same about the cathedral. But such questions come later. The first thing is to understand the object before you. As long as you think the corkscrew was meant for opening tins, or the cathedral for entertaining tourists, you can say nothing to the purpose about them. Now, many literary critics have been as frustrated by fantasy in general, and Tolkien's Lord of the Rings in particular, as if they were trying to open a can of anchovies with a corkscrew. If it can be done at all, it creates kind of a mess. And the result may well be that the critic just declares the corkscrew to be a worthless invention, while the bottle of Cabernet Sauvignon sits on the shelf untouched and disregarded. So let us start our journey by asking a seemingly basic question. Is fantasy? How do we define it? And the answer to this question will allow us to approach study with the right tools and the right aim, with both wisdom and humility. Now, 60 years after the appearance of The Lord of the Rings, it really is tempting to say that fantasy is the kind of thing that Tolkien wrote, but this won't do. No. The elements of Tolkien's work that now seem most recognizable as markers of fantasy, wizards, elves, dwarves, medieval settings, quests, these things have come to seem particularly important through dint of so much imitation, but they're not, in fact, essential elements of the genre. Nor are they the elements that make The Lord of the Rings so innovative and so powerful. And if we bring these preconceptions about fantasy to a consideration of the genre, we'll very likely miss exactly what we most need to see. Furthermore, if we recognize that Tolkien is a paradigmatic fantasy author, his friend and colleague C.S. Lewis would probably be a close follow-up. But then the diversity of Lewis's fiction should give us pause. The Chronicles of Narnia are different from The Lord of the Rings in many ways. And what about the Ransom trilogy, or Till We Have Faces? And if we include Lewis's writings alongside those of Tolkien in our default definition of fantasy, should we therefore also include those of a writer who is known to them both, their fellow Inklings member, Charles Williams? And once Lewis and Williams are in the picture, what about G.K. Chesterton? Does he have any place in the genre? So our approach to fantasy must not start out on the naive assumption that Middle-earth is our yardstick. That's to beg the question in a pro-Tolkien direction, just the same way that other approaches beg it in an anti-Tolkien direction. Our exploration has to start with the smallest possible number of initial assumptions about what we might find as we examine the genre. But at the same time, we must have some boundaries to our investigation, or else it'll never end, nor will this lecture. So when I am speaking of fantasy, I'm referring to modern fantasy, with a particular emphasis on the modern fantasy novel. Now, by modern, I refer to works written after about the middle of the 19th century, primarily because certain distinctive characteristics of the fantasy novel as we know it today appeared around that time, mid-19th century. So my working definition of the fantasy novel is based on a constellation of characteristics, not one single thing, but a grouping. So my definition is that a modern fantasy novel is, first, a literary work that evokes secondary belief by its inner consistency of reality. We'll come back to both of those points later. It evokes secondary belief by its inner consistency of reality, whatever its literary style or the nature of its story world may be. And it also includes two out of the following three features. First, one of these features is it draws on source material in history, folklore, myth, or legend, that it includes some aspect of the supernatural or the transcendent, or at a minimum evokes a sense of wonder. And it takes place in whole or in part in some version of a secondary world. Now you'll note that I've described fantasy here primarily on the basis of how the story works, rather than what's in it. That's on purpose. And as we'll see a little later, Tolkien makes this very point about the functioning of fantasy in his essay on fairy stories. Now, by considering fantasy in this way, we can gain a more nuanced view of the genre and better understand how it relates to other forms. We can place fantasy among its related genres. So we can see, for instance, that science fiction and horror are recognizable as fantasy's closest cousins. But other related genres include the surreal, satire, utopias and dystopias, stories that are presented as dreams or visions or hallucinations, magical realism, and contemporary literary fiction that includes elements of the fantastic. These are related to fantasy, but not quite the same thing. They don't hit all the features of my definition. So by framing the definition in this way, we allow for recognition of both diversity within the genre and also unity within the genre, distinguishing it from other related sort of literary cousins. So turning back to fantasy as a genre, one fantasy author might, for instance, evoke a sense of wonder and the transcendent with a plot that includes the Holy Grail being found in 1930s England. Another might evoke this sense of wonder through deliberately stylized and archaic language, telling of epic warfare on a fantasy Mars. And I will note, by the way, that Edison was an influence on C.S. Lewis, one of the authors that I talk about in my book, Tolkien's Modern Sources. A novel's rootedness in myth might result, for instance, in a trickster character based on the Native American coyote or on the Norse Loki. Now, as we consider the secondary worlds of fantasy, we see that they're widely varied, but every fantasy world is set apart in some way from the reader's own world. Whether there's a connection or not, there might be, but in some way it's set apart. And the secondary world, in some way, draws the reader in to experience this secondary world as a consistent, believable reality. And this might be the case whether it's set in a world of talking rabbits on a quest for a new home, or a modern-day boarding school for young wizards and witches. So we can see, with this diverse sampling of fantasy, just a sampling of the many works that I could have chosen to illustrate these points, we can see that it's not the presence of dwarves and elves, magical items, a medieval setting, or a quest that makes a fantasy, but rather the way that the author has constructed the fantasy world and invited the reader to participate in it. So, looking at The Lord of the Rings with this definition in mind, we can see that it really is at the heart of the fantasy genre, with all four characteristics fully present. Our intuition, when it said fantasy is something like The Lord of the Rings, our intuition was not wrong. We just had to shape it and clarify it. We can see that the response of readers through the years abundantly testifies to the novel's evocation of secondary belief. Its literary and folkloric roots run deep and can be seen in elements such as the elves, the Barrow Wights, or the Old English flavored culture of the Rohirrim. It's infused with a sense of the transcendent, morally, spiritually, aesthetically. It evokes wonder and terror at many points, from the Hobbit's sojourn in Rivendell to Frodo's departure at the Grey Havens. And Middle-earth is very probably the most vividly and completely realized secondary world ever created. So we can see then that what makes the Lord of the Rings fantasy is not its elves and dwarves and so on, it's how it's made, what it's made from, and this will allow us better understand how it works. Now you'll have noted that in my definition, I do not make any effort to distinguish between popular and literary fantasy. Now one of the delights of this genre is that it confounds the expectations both of the populist and the elitist critic in equal measure. The buyer and the reader of fantasy novels persists in enjoying what he enjoys without apology, and in so doing finds a staunch ally in Tolkien. I have claimed, he said, that escape is one of the main functions of fairy stories, and since I do not disapprove of them, it is plain that I do not accept the tone of scorn or pity with which escape is so often used, a tone for which the uses of the word outside literary criticism give no warrant at all. And considering Tolkien's views on escapist literature brings us now to his seminal essay on fantasy literature on fairy stories. Because Tolkien did not merely write the novel that shaped the genre of modern fantasy, he also made a very precise and powerful analysis of how fantasy works. His essay on fairy stories had its origins as the Andrew Lang Lecture in 1939 at University of St Andrews in Scotland. This essay comes at a pivotal point in Tolkien's development as a fantasist. He'd been working for many years on the various stories and poems of his legendarium, which would come to be called the Silmarillion. He'd published The Hobbit, and he'd begun work on the Hobbit sequel that would become The Lord of the Rings. On Fairy Stories is, as scholar Roland Klieger puts it, the template on which Tolkien shaped his idea of subcreation and the manifesto in which he declared his particular concept of what fantasy is and how it ought to work. And Tolkien begins in this essay by pointing out that the definition of a fairy story, he says, what it is or what it should be, does not depend on any definition or historical account of elf or fairy. So Tolkien, having freed fantasy from a requirement that it contain fairies, he goes on to tighten his argument, his definition, by arguing for the exclusion of travelers' tales, beast fables, and stories that use a dream framework. Now, he's not saying those are bad forms. He's just clarifying his definition. These are a different form. They're not fantasy. So as he explores the idea of fantasy, Tolkien finds that earlier uses by literary critics of the words imagination and fancy were inadequate for the literary art under discussion. So Tolkien argues that we need a distinct name for the achievement of the expression of the imagination, which gives or seems to give the inner consistency of reality. And this faculty he gives the name fantasy. A genuine fantasy, according to Tolkien, generates what he calls secondary belief, which is a quality distinct from garden variety suspension and disbelief. It's an essential quality of fantasy that it creates an immersive experience for the reader. In a good fantasy, the author is a sub-creator. As Tolkien puts it, He makes a secondary world which your mind can enter. Inside, what he relates is true. It accords with the laws of that world. You therefore believe it while you were, as it were, inside. Now, to illustrate the difference between secondary belief and mere willing suspension of disbelief, I want to give you an example of one that I've constructed for myself. Consider a group of friends gathered around the big screen TV to watch the Super Bowl. Now, imagine the true football enthusiast. He has invited his friends over, and he watches the game in a state of full secondary belief. He enters the world of the game. He urges on the players. He yells at the referee as if he could thereby influence his calls. He's plunged into gloom or elated by joy by the events he sees on the screen. Now imagine his neighbor, whom he's invited over for a Super Bowl party. And his neighbor, not so into football, but he wants to be sociable, so he comes over. Now he must take an interest in the game, or else it will be a really dull evening, even if there are snacks. So he cheers for his chosen team willingly enough. However, in so doing, he has merely suspended his disbelief, which, as Tolkien puts it, is a substitute for the genuine thing. Insofar as the neighbor enjoys himself, he enjoys the camaraderie for which the game is the excuse, rather than the game itself, and he's unlikely to watch other games on his own initiative. So this is the same case with fantasy novels. The full immersive experience of readers in a work of fantasy literature is much more than mere suspension of disbelief, kind of playing along while you're reading it. A reader who's like the neighbor in my football illustration, a reader who's sort of self-consciously aware of the artificiality of secondary world might kind of play along with the author, but even having to make that effort means that secondary belief never really came into effect at all. Now, to be sure, the reader's intentions, interests, and prior experience all have an influence on the formation of secondary belief. Some readers are much more readily drawn into a secondary world of fiction, just as some authors are particularly skilled at exciting secondary belief in even somewhat reluctant visitors to their literary world. And now, for instance, J.R.R. Rowling, whatever you might think of the literary merits of her prose, I'd give it kind of like a B+. She's clearly very good at drawing in readers into her secondary world. So we can see that there's different gradations of secondary belief and encouraging suspension of disbelief. Now, I want to note that secondary belief can also be found in other genres, not just fantasy. It can be found in realistic genres as well. So, for instance, when we're reading Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice, we're walking the grounds of Pemberley, and we feel like we've entered into an imaginative world. It's an environment that was created by its author. It's been crafted especially for particular imaginative ends. It draws us in and makes us believe in it. So while we're reading Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice, we feel like Pemberley is a real place. We feel like Elizabeth Bennet and Mr. Darcy are real people in a real world. And we think, surely if I were to visit there, I might meet them. Yes. So we have here this idea of secondary belief as a characteristic of at least some genres of fiction, including realistic fiction. But it is by no means a characteristic of all literary fiction. In other genres, the reader is intended to remain conscious of the story, as with parody, with some forms of allegory, or with satire, or with surrealism. Now, in those forms, the reader may greatly appreciate a story in the writer's art, but not experience immersion in the story world while reading it, and that might not be the author's intention at all. Different genres work in different ways. So, what makes fantasy different from other genres? Well, for one thing, fantasy can operate more freely than realistic fiction, since the author is not limited to writing about things that exist or could exist in the primary world. Now, this creative freedom is a two-edged sword. On the one hand, it helps the fantasists to achieve what Tolkien calls the necessary quality of strangeness and wonder, but it also makes it more challenging to achieve the equally necessary inner consistency of reality for that imagined world. And Tolkien goes on to say, anyone inheriting the fantastic device of human language can say the green sun. Many can then imagine or picture it, but that is not enough. To make a secondary world inside which the green sun will be credible, commanding secondary belief, will probably require a labor and thought, and will certainly demand a special skill, a kind of elvish craft. And the result of this special skill and labor is the literary art called fantasy, which Tolkien calls story-making in its primary and most potent mode. Now, the concept of secondary belief is important for our purposes because fantasy, as distinct from other forms of literature, is both non-realistic and believable. Both subcreation and secondary belief are significant defining features of fantasy because they point towards fantasy's relationship with reality. And here we turn from defining fantasy to examining how it works. What is its function? What does it do that other genres don't, or don't do as well? And here, Tolkien offers us three important concepts about the function of fantasy in his essay on fairy stories. These three functions are recovery, escape, and consolation. And we will briefly consider each one in turn. One of the functions of fantasy, Tolkien argues, is to promote recovery, the regaining of a clear view. Using the metaphor of a dirty, smudged window, whose film of grime obscures what we see through it, he says that we need to clean our windows so that the things seen clearly may be freed from the drab blur of triteness or familiarity, from possessiveness. See, when we think we know something, we often stop seeing it, stop really seeing it. We might, for instance, use words like love, forgiveness, and justice without really grasping their messy, painful, transformative reality. In day-to-day relationships, we may no longer see our family, our friends, our neighbors as themselves, as individual people. But we may end up seeing them in a sort of utilitarian way in terms of what they can do for us. And indeed, Tolkien notes that familiar faces are the most difficult really to see with fresh attention, perceiving their likeness and unlikeness, that they are faces and yet unique faces. Fantasy, with its function of recovery, can help us to see more clearly what's in front of us in our day-to-day lives. Not just people, all sorts of things. The environment, for instance. After we've spent time in Middle-earth with the Ents, Treebeard, and the other shepherds of the trees, we can look at an ordinary tree, a pine or an oak, and think, wow, trees are really kind of amazing. And we can see it. We can see it maybe in a way that we hadn't seen before. Something like Rivendell can help us to appreciate the simple pleasures of home. We've appreciated the homely house and the joy of being there. We might somehow be able to more completely recognize those simple pleasures of a meal spent shared with our family. So we can experience this recovery of vision, moving from the Ents and Rivendell to our own day-to-day life, our back garden, our dining room table. And the recovery that we experience in a fantasy story can run even deeper and help us to regain or even to create or discover meaning for words or ideas that are otherwise abstract or maybe dull from use or overuse. So for instance, in reading The Lord of the Rings, we can be moved by the kingliness of Aragorn or the self-sacrifice of Frodo, and therefore respond more intuitively, more immediately, more deeply to the image of Christ the King, or the image of our Lord on the way of the cross. And here we can see one of the reasons why fantasy novels so often draw on source material in history, folklore, myth, and legend, one of the defining characteristics that I noted of fantasy novels. When we read a story that's set in the past, or in an imagined version of the past, it becomes a little easier for us to experience recovery because the familiar has been made strange. As L.P. Hartley put it, the past is a foreign country. They do things differently there. And when a story draws on a well-known legend, such as the story of King Arthur, we've got a point of contact in the familiarity, yet at the same time, it's an entrance into a new and strange territory. And this experience of strangeness mixed with familiarity helps us to experience that recovery of vision, which is a key characteristic of fantasy. Now, the second function of fantasy, according to Tolkien, is that of escape. And we should now address a certain more serious charge from certain disdainful literary critics. The claim that the escape offered by fantasy is an immature, even antisocial experience. Oh, come on, they say. Stories about kingdoms that never existed, being threatened by imaginary monsters, get real. People being rescued through magic doesn't encourage a kind of emotional or social truancy from the serious issues of real life. They might say it's fine for children to read about knights and wizards, but adults should grow out of it and graduate into reading novels that address life as it really is. Right? Just stick to nonfiction and be safe, right? Well, you can probably gather I don't find this objection holds water. But maybe not, you might not have realized quite why this objection doesn't work. To begin with, stories that are set in the so-called real world may in fact offer to the reader a view of the world that is every bit as unrealistic in its own way as any novel with elves and magic. Pick up popular fiction, theoretically realistic fiction, and you'll often find a world in which violence solves problems. A world in which drug-fueled parties are exciting. One in which wealth and power are readily available. A world in which adultery can happen without those messy consequences of shattered families and betrayed friends. A world in which women magically make bad men good by the power of their love or through sex. Yeah. No. Escapism, in its negative sense, is far more likely to be produced by what C.S. Lewis calls superficially realistic literature, which presents things that really might happen, that ought to happen, that would have happened if the reader had had a fair chance. This kind of escapism is far more likely than fantasy to provoke envy, discontent with one's own life, and refusal to deal with the life and the relationships that a person actually has. And worse, it can give a gloss of excitement or normality to behavior that in real life is destructive. Adultery, drug-taking, abusive relationships. This is not good. Now, fantasy can be escapist in the negative sense, to be sure, but it would be a feature of bad fantasy. just as it's a feature of bad literature of any genre or bad art in any form. Taking pleasure in the escape offered by a fantasy novel is not a mark of immaturity or shallowness. Far from it. Depending on circumstances, escape may be sensible or even heroic, just as it might be in real life. As Tolkien puts it, and we must keep in mind that he served on the front lines in World War I. As Tolkien puts it, why should a man be scorned if, finding himself in prison, he tries to get out and go home? Or if when he cannot do so, he thinks and talks about other topics than jailers and prison walls? The world outside does not become less real because the prisoner cannot see it. In using escape in this way, the critics have chosen the wrong word, and what is more, they are confusing, not always by sincere error, the escape of the prisoner with the flight of the deserter. So again, as a veteran of the First World War, he might well have been taken prisoner by the Germans. He wasn't. As a matter of fact, he suffered from trench fever, which undoubtedly saved his life, although it damaged his health considerably. Tolkien had a very vivid image of how it could be indeed your duty to escape if you were a prisoner of the enemy. And to escape means to recognize both something negative to be escaped from and something positive to be escaped into. And so, the experience of fantasy is a constant dialogue with reality, both as it is and how it could or should be. So a reader who escapes into a good fantasy does not return unchanged to real life. Now, the third function that Tolkien describes is consolation. One of the characteristics of fantasy, in my definition, is that it includes some aspect of the supernatural or the transcendent, or at a minimum evokes a sense of wonder. And this is one of the reasons why magic, in one form or another, is such a frequent element in fantasy stories, although it's not a necessary element. Magic in a story hints at a dimension to the world that's beyond what we see on the surface. It suggests the supernatural, at least in the sense of something beyond what we expect. It challenges the materialist and naturalist assumptions of the world. Now, Tolkien's own handling of the element of the transcendent is particularly intriguing. As a devout Catholic, he firmly believed in the supernatural dimension of reality, the existence of God, the reality of grace and the sacraments. But he didn't put this directly into his fantasy stories. Indeed, he deliberately refrained from having any overt references to religion, to God, or any instances of worship in Middle-earth. However, he certainly evokes a sense of wonder throughout his stories, from the Malor trees of Lothlorien to the massive city of Gondor. We marvel at his world. But that's not all. Tolkien's sense of the transcendent is woven into the very fabric of the story. And he explains how this works in his discussion of what he calls consolation, and above all, the consolation of the happy ending. To explain the idea of consolation, Tolkien coins the word eucatastrophe. It's formed of eu, meaning good, attached to catastrophe, and it means the good catastrophe. Wait, what's that? The unexpected happy ending, which gives us a profound taste of joy. And we see it in The Lord of the Rings with the rescue of Frodo and Sam after the destruction of the ring, when they are sure that all is lost. And we see it even more fully in the final chapters, and indeed the final pages of the tale. The eucatastrophic vision includes the reversal of tragedy, the turn in the story that leads to joy, joy beyond the walls of the world. But in order for there to be eucatastrophe, there has to be a recognition of discatastrophe, of real tragedy, of real loss and sorrow. So we have all this bound up in Tolkien's idea of eucatastrophe. And it connects here with his understanding of the gospel. Because Tolkien argues in his essay on fairy stories that the reason that the unexpected happy ending of The Lord of the Rings or a fairy tale, any happy ending moves us because every happy ending is a faraway echo of the cosmic happy ending of the resurrection. He writes that the incarnation of Christ is the eucatastrophe of man's history, and the resurrection is the eucatastrophe of the incarnation. Here we have God's unexpected happy ending to the tragedy of the human story. And this is written in reality. It's part of the fabric of the cosmos. It's something that is true. And so, Tolkien argues, we intuit that even if we do not believe. We recognize the power of it without even recognizing it in our response to a happy ending. We are responding to the resurrection echoed through the happy ending of the story. And so we can see that Tolkien gives us a true eucatastrophe. He gives us both the happy ending, but he also gives us the tragedy that leads up to it. The reason the happy ending is meaningful is that we really think that all is lost. We look forward to Easter, but we have to recognize that Good Friday comes first. If we don't go through the path of the cross, we don't recognize the gift of the resurrection. Now, Tolkien's vision of the world was a clear-eyed one. He knows that our human experience includes both loss and pain. This was a man who lost his father as a young child, lost his mother when he was a young teenager. He fought in the trenches of World War I, where most of his close friends were killed. He is a man who suffered many illnesses throughout his life. And he was also a man who was a devout Christian, a good husband, a good father and grandfather, a good friend and colleague. He knew sorrow and suffering. He knew joy and love. And his understanding of fantasy includes this rich understanding of the realities of life. And here we can see part of Tolkien's gift. Like his friend and fellow Inkling C.S. Lewis, Tolkien could present a convincing and attractive vision of the Christian faith through his stories precisely because his faith, and thus his literary vision, included the dark but knew that the light triumphs. It's because he recognized the darkness that Tolkien could show a convincing joy. Now, we've talked tonight about subcreation, about literary belief, about secondary belief. And one of the reasons that subcreation and secondary belief are defining features of fantasy is that they point toward fantasy's relationship with that richness of reality, and, more broadly speaking, toward the connection between imagination and reason. Tolkien writes, "Fantasy is a natural human activity. It certainly does not destroy or even insult reason, and it does not either blunt the appetite for nor obscure the perception of scientific verity. On the contrary, the keener and clearer is the reason, the better fantasy will it make. If men were ever in a state in which they did not want to know or could not perceive truth, facts or evidence, then fantasy would languish until they were cured. If they ever get into that state, it would not seem at all possible. Fantasy will perish and become morbid delusion." Fantasy, as Tolkien defines it, is not a flight from the primary world, but a creative engagement with it. By its what-ifs, its imaginings of things that are not, never were, and perhaps never could be, fantasy illuminates what is, what was, and what could be. Tolkien's high view of fantasy is grounded in his understanding of the sub-creative act as a reflection of the divine creative act, He writes, "We make in our measure and in our derivative mode because we are made, and not only made, but made in the image and likeness of a maker." Fallen human beings make creative fantasy because we bear the image of God. And so for Tolkien, fantasy is serious, even at its most playful and extravagant. Tolkien reminds all readers and all critics, whether or not they agree with the Christian foundation of his view, that both the creation and the reception of imaginative literature are markers of human dignity, creativity, and freedom. And fantasy, seen in this light, is much more than just entertainment or whimsy. The what if of fantasy, worked out consistently, allows for an imaginative exploration of what it means to be human and what larger meaning there might be in our lives. Done well, it cultivates health and wholeness of mind and heart, of reason and imagination, and it helps us to be more fully human. Thank you.